Russia was invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time Hitler killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. They don't want to have Ukraine join NATO. So when the wall came down in the Soviet Union, Europe, Gorbachev destroyed himself politically by doing something that was very, very courageous. He went to Bush and he said, I'm going to allow you to reunify Germany under a NATO army. I'm going to remove 450,000 Soviet troops, but I want your commitment. After that, you will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. And we solemnly swore we wouldn't do it. Well, then in 97, Brzezinski, who was the first of the neocons, said, we're going to move NATO 1,000 miles to the east and take 15 countries into it and surround the Soviet Union. So then we not only move it into 14 new nations, but we unilaterally walk away from our 2 nuclear weapons treaties with the Russians. And we put Aegis missile systems in Romania and Poland 12 minutes from Moscow. When the Russians did that to Cuba in '62, we came this close to nuclear war until they removed them. So the Russians don't want nukes 400 miles from Moscow. We then overthrow the Ukraine government. In 2014, their elected government, and put in a Western sympathetic government. Russia then has to go into Crimea because they have a port. It's their only warm water port. And they know the new government that we just installed is going to invite the U.S. Navy into their port. So Russia then went into Crimea without firing a shot, because the people of Crimea are Russian. Then the new Ukrainian government we installed started killing ethnic Russians in Donbass and Lugansk, and they voted to leave and join Russia. Putin said, I don't want them. Let's give them protection and give them semi-autonomy and make an agreement to keep NATO out of Ukraine. That treaty was written by Germany, France, Russia, and England, the Minsk Accords. And the Ukrainian parliament, which is controlled by ultra-rightists, and that's a nice way of talking about them, refused to sign it. Zelensky runs in 2019. He's an actor. Why did he get elected with 70% of the vote? Because he promised to sign the Minsk Accords. He promised peace. He gets in there and he pivots. Nobody can explain why, but we know why. Because he was threatened with death by ultra-rightists in his government and a withdrawal of support by the United States by Victoria Nuland, who's the leading neocon in the State Department. We told him he could not sign it. So then the Russians go in. They don't send a big army. They only send 40,000 people. It's a nation of 44 million people. They clearly do not intend to conquer Ukraine. But they want us back at the negotiating table. We won't allow Zelensky to go back. So he goes to Israel and Turkey and says, will you please help me negotiate a treaty? The Russians just want a guarantee that Ukraine won't join NATO. Zelensky signs the treaty. Putin's people sign the treaty. And Putin starts withdrawing the Russian troops in good faith. And what happens? Joe Biden sends Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, over to Ukraine in April and forces him to tear up the treaty. And since then, 450,000 kids have died who none of them should have died. For every one Russian that dies, 5 to 8 Ukrainians die, and they don't have any men left. You know, we're giving them all these weapons, but they don't have men left. It's a catastrophe, and we look kind of like the aggressor. That's the way the rest of the world sees us. 2014, there are riots it's called the Majdan Rebellion in Ukraine, which we're not told that we are financing those riots. The newspapers never told us, our government never told us. USAID, which is a CIA front, put $5 billion into funding those riots. Those riots lead to a coup d'etat against the first democratically elected government of the Ukraine. It was a government that refused to choose sides and to say we're going to be on the side of the West. So we wanted them out. A month before that government is overthrown, Victoria Nuland, who's the part of the centerpiece of the neocon ideology and who is now a high-level official in the State Department, has a secret call with the U.S. ambassador, which is tape recorded and is now public, which anybody can go and look up, where she is picking the new cabinet for the Ukraine, which is which is a U.S. Western cabinet. So they're picking the new government a month before the old government is overthrown.
Is that how democracy? Is that democracy when Victoria Nuland picks her government?
Well, that's the point. Is USAID doesn't really do, and the CIA don't do democracy. The CIA has overthrown, I think, 83 governments between 1947 and 1997. That's a third of the governments on Earth, and most of them were democracies. Oh, it doesn't do democracy. It does coup d'etat.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now, so we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking, in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay. Good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
My understanding from that call, but you tell me, was that the big three were going into their own meeting and that Yachts was going to offer in that context a three-way, you know, 3+1 conversation or 3+2 with you. Is that not how you understood it?
No, I mean, that's what he proposed, but I think just knowing the dynamic that's been with them where Klitschko has been the top dog, he's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got. He's probably talking to his guys at this point. So I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the three, and it gives you also a chance to move fast on all this stuff and put us behind it before they all sit down and he explains why he doesn't like it.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Okay, I've now written, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
I can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah, okay. I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it. And again, the fact that this is out there right now, I'm still trying to figure out in my mind why Yanukovych did that. But in the meantime, there's a Party of Regions faction meeting going on right now, and I'm sure there's a lively argument going on in that group at this point. But anyway, we could land jelly set up on this one if we move fast. So let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
And Putin actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to its borders. This is fundamentally not about NATO expansion.
It was never about NATO enlargement.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO expanding toward Russia.
This was never about NATO.
It's absolutely nothing to do with NATO expansionism.
And it has nothing to do with NATO.
This is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not really about NATO.
This is not about NATO.
Seriously, it's not about NATO.
This was never about NATO.
It was never about NATO. Let's be honest.
This doesn't have anything to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO at all.
Yeah, he's claiming it's like security purposes, but we can see the clear reason.
But NATO is not the reason. This is not about NATO expansion. This is about the democratic expansion.
Ukraine bans religious organizations.
We are protecting democracy right now.
Ukraine is banning political parties.
Because it's a democracy.
Ukraine restricts books and music.
It's about democracy.
Ukraine won't hold elections.
It's about democracy.
And it's not about NATO expansion.
This war in Ukraine is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
That's not about NATO.
It has nothing to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO expansion.
It's not about NATO expansion.
Nothing to do with NATO.
It isn't really about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO enlargement.
In fact, it has nothing to do with NATO.
It's not about NATO encroaching.
It's not about NATO. NATO is just a fictitious, imaginary adversary for Mr. Putin and for Russia.
It was never about NATO.
That's not what it's been about. It's been about him trying to expand his sphere of influence.
Hang on, I mean, the two are not mutually exclusive. Obviously, Russia has wished for a sphere of influence over Ukraine, but if the West had not challenged Russian interests so directly, I think that there was a chance to avoid this war.
He wanted us to sign a promise never to enlarge NATO. We rejected that.
The reason why Putin invaded Ukraine is because of his evil.
It's
about that Putin wants to rebuild Soviet empire of evil, like President Reagan told.
It's about Putin being sick.
I don't know how you negotiate peace with a madman, but
Nobody negotiated with Hitler.
People are comparing him to Hitler.
And remember Hitler.
He's a Hitler.
We're back when the Nazis invaded Poland.
this is exactly the same what Hitler was doing to Jews.
This is the same. Putin will not stop.
Putin is reminiscent of Hitler.
This
reminds me of Hitler.
Hitler.
He's the new Hitler.
Who Hitler?
This is about a butcher trying to kill people everywhere in the world, just not Ukraine, Syria, all over the place.
This is a war that should have never happened. It's a war that Russians tried repeatedly to settle on terms that were very, very beneficial to Ukraine and us. The major thing they wanted was for us to keep NATO out of the Ukraine. The big military contractors want to add new countries to NATO all the time. Why? Because then that country has to conform its military purchases to NATO weapon specifications, which means certain companies, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, and Lockheed, get a trapped market. In March of 2022, we committed $113 billion. Just to give you an example, we could have built a home for almost every homeless person in this country. We then committed another $24 billion since then, 2 months ago, and now President Biden's asking for another $60 billion. But the big, big expenses are going to come after the war, when we have to rebuild all the things that we destroyed. Mitch McConnell was asked, can we really afford to spend $113 billion to Ukraine? He said, don't worry. It's not really going to Ukraine.
It's going to American defense manufacturers.
So he just admitted it's a money laundering scheme. And who do you think owns every one of those companies? BlackRock. So Tim Scott, during the Republican debate, said, don't worry, it's not a gift to Ukraine, it's a loan. So raise your hand if you think that that loan's ever getting paid back. Yeah, of course it's not. So why do they call it a loan? Because if they call it a loan, they can impose loan conditions. And what are the loan conditions that we impose on? Number one, an extreme austerity program, so that if you're poor in Ukraine, you're going to be poor forever. Number two, most important, Ukraine has to put all of its government-owned assets up for sale to multinational corporations, including all of its agricultural land, the biggest single asset in Europe. In Ukraine, there's been 1,000 years of war fought over that land. It's the richest farmland in the world. It's the breadbasket of Europe. 500,000 kids almost, Ukrainian kids, have died to keep that land as part of Ukraine. They almost certainly didn't know about this loan condition. They've already sold 30% of it. The buyers were DuPont, Cargill, and Monsanto. Who do you think owns all of those companies? Yeah, BlackRock. And then in December, President Biden gave out the contract to rebuild Ukraine. And who do you think got that contract? BlackRock. So they're doing this right in front of us. They don't even care that we know anymore, because they know that they can get away with it. And how do they know that? Because they have a strategy. And that strategy is an old strategy. which is they keep us at war with each other. They keep us hating on each other. They keep the Republicans and Democrats fighting each other, black against white, and all these divisions that they sow